Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at what is arguably one of New Zealand's best, most interesting Syrahs. So this is a wine from the Hawke's Bay. This is Tom Syrah. It's the 2021 vintage of that, and that's from the Church Road Winery. To give it its full name, it's the Tom McDonald Church Road Syrah. The winery is one of the more historic wineries in New Zealand. The region of Hawke's Bay has some very old wineries, unlike Marlborough, Martinborough, Central Otago, all relatively recently founded wine producing regions. This particular winery was founded as Taradale Vineyards in 1897 by somebody called Bartholomew Steinmetz. A few years later, in 1921, a young man called Tom McDonald came to work there, after whom this is named. He was 14 at the time. He was obviously an exceptional young man, as 5 years later he was running the winery. And in fact, he remained involved in winemaking at this winery and in the Hawke's Bay region right up until his death in the late 1980s. McDonald was a huge figure. The Australian winemaking family, McWilliams, had invested in the winery and owned it. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to try some of their Cabernets dating back to the 1950s, and some of them were still holding up really well. This particular range, the Tom McDonald wines, were launched in 1995, and at that stage there was a single wine. It was a Cabernet Merlot blend. Today they make 3 wines in the range. There's the Syrah, there's a Cabernet and Merlot. Sometimes it's a Merlot Cabernet. It depends what the fruit is like in a particular vintage, and they also make a Chardonnay. These aren't wines that are necessarily made every year. If the quality of the fruit isn't up to it, they won't launch a wine from that variety in that particular year. These days, Church Road as a winery is in the hands of Pernod Ricard, a large international winemaking group. And actually, with that in mind, it's strange that the wines aren't more readily distributed internationally. I think they've been more interested in marketing wines from Marlborough, from other wineries they own. And Church Road tends to be quite a large production winery of high quality that is much more readily seen on the New Zealand market than exported. A certain amount is exported, but it's not as well known outside New Zealand. The current winemaker, Chris Scott, is a very well-known figure in the Hawke's Bay region, excellent winemaker, and has been running the winery here since 2005, so that's given quite a lot of continuity in style and quality to Church Road and their wines. This particular wine is made with fruit from the Redstone vineyard. Now, Redstone sits as part of the Bridgepar Triangle, and within Hawke's Bay there are 2 regions of relatively flat land, free draining soils that have been defined and have established a reputation for producing quality wines that's actually enshrined in law. There are associations governing the making of these wines. One is Bridgepar Triangle, which is where Redstone is, and then the other is the Gimlet Gravels. Within Bridgepar Triangle, Redstone, this particular vineyard of Church Roads, is actually one of the warmest sites, and that's because it's sheltered by a fairly prominent geographical feature nearby Roy's Hill, and that shelters it from the breeze and makes it a slightly warmer site than those surrounding it, making it more suitable for the production of late ripening red varieties such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah. Not surprisingly called Redstone, the soils are rich in iron. They're predominantly a free draining greywacke with just quite a loose covering of wind blown loess over the top. 2021 was a good vintage for the Hawke's Bay. It was warm, relatively dry. In fact, they had to work fairly hard to monitor the water levels in the Redstone vineyard. We're using limited deficit irrigation just to make sure that the vines promoted ripening by not having too much water available to them. The fruit is hand harvested. There was careful selection went on at the winery on arrival. A portion of the fruit, I think 9% of the total, was fermented as whole bunches, just to give some slightly different aromatics, and also to extend the fermentation out a bit as the berries split later in fermentation, releasing juices. Fermentation went on at quite high temperatures. They allowed the ferment to go up to 34 degrees Celsius, which if you go much higher than that could actually shock the yeast. So but that's quite extractive. It's quite good at pulling tannins, particularly, and also aromas out of the fruit. Fermentation went on, I believe, in stainless steel tanks. The wine was then allowed to sit with its skins post-fermentation for 2 to 3 weeks. So again, promoting extraction there. And the oxidation that goes on at that stage fixes tannins quite well in the wine as well, so that's a benefit. After the maceration, the wine was moved into French oak barriques, just over a third of which were new. And there it stayed for 17 months. The first 6 months of that on the lees, just again giving a little bit more richness. And then prior to bottling, the very best lots were selected to go into the Tom, and presumably the other lots were declassified into the single vineyard Syrah that they make in the quality range just below this. To preserve the lovely quality of the fruit, the wine was simply racked. It wasn't fined or filtered, but after 17 months sitting in a barrel is quite a lot of time for anything you don't want in the wine to settle out, so should be completely stable. Right, so let's have a look at the wine, shall we? My first impression is it's got this quite vivid purple rim. It's almost a sort of a blue, reddish blue purple. But the wine has quite deep, dark colour, this purple red. It's pretty much opaque. I can't really see through that. It's staining the glass as I swirl it. Didn't see what the alcohol was. Just 13.5%. So that will be why it's not. It's taking a little while to form tears on the side of the glass there. Let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Ooh, that's quite classically Syrah. There's a sort of a meaty, a rich, ripe red fruit with meaty tones. There's really sort of opulent plum prune sort of notes, very ripe black cherry maybe, quite heady. And over the top of that, there's a very vivid, peppery aroma. Very cleanly done. Maybe some hints of vanilla there from the oak, but really well integrated there. Just adding a sort of a sweet, attractive top note to the perfume. So let's have a taste. The wine has very fine tannins, quite a big structure. There's a rich warmth, which I might almost think was alcohol, but as I say, actually it's only 13.5%, and it does fade quite quickly in terms of the warmth. That is just the fruit richness, and it's leaving there a sort of an almost plum skin richness. I suppose there's a slightly drying note, and the pepper is coming through there at that stage on the mid palate. I mean, this is still a very young wine. This particular vintage has only just been released, but there is really a joyous, ebullient, ripe fruit there with some really good depth. It has a much more sort of supple, rich, more sort of juicy, one might suggest New World style, although some of the really good Syrahs of the Northern Rhone will also have this lovely, fresh, beautiful, lifted red fruit. But it is more towards that. There is a lovely spiciness. There isn't yet a sort of an earthiness. And the meatiness that I noted on the nose hasn't yet really shown itself on the palate there. So you've got this sort of quite lifted, rich, dark, black cherry, peony sort of notes, very juicy fruit at the beginning. You've got almost sort of licoricey, rich core, maybe with a little tiny touch of graphite in terms of the texture. You know, a full-bodied wine, but not although it is a touch drying, not astringent. It's not dried out. There's enough fruit there to keep it lasting really well. The flavours, those lovely lifted sort of red to black fruits are really showing through at the end there, and they're showing through as sort of juicy and lively, and that's all suggesting that there's some really nice acidity there, although the acidity's not standing out. It's nicely and balanced, as indeed of course is the alcohol. So yes, I think that's a wine with some fabulous potential. Very attractive now, although still very young. I'm sure that if you leave this for 4 or 5 years at least, this is going to really open up even more. But yeah, to broach it as a young wine, that's very impressive. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you'll take some time to look perhaps at some of the wines from Church Road. If you do, please leave us a note in the comments. If you have any views on the video or the tasting or the wines themselves, leave those comments as well. Do please feel free to sign up and follow us on YouTube, but most importantly, I hope the tasting interested you enough that you may join us in the near future for another tasting, because it would be great to see you there. Thanks. Bye now.